Young and the Restless spoilers shock. The news didn't spread so much as detonate, and for several dizzying hours Genoa City breathed inside the pressure wave of a single sentence: Claire is pregnant. Speculation did the rest. In boardrooms and coffee lines and hallways where secrets tend to pause before choosing a direction, three names rose and collided until they became less like men and more like hypothetical. Holden, Nate. Kyle led the betting markets of gossip for obvious reasons. Proximity and promise write louder stories than truth ever does. And he had been the face beside her at openings, and the voice in her ear when strategy slid toward theater. Holden, the friend with inconvenient timing and delayed flights, carried just enough mystery to make strangers confident. And then there was Nate, whose calm, precise manner and complicated history with Victoria made him a name people said softly and then repeated in their own heads, drawing lines on invisible maps they weren't sure they wanted to see completed. Kyle, and guarded and earnest, let joy move into him like it had been looking for a place to live, and for a moment the way he walked told you he was already practicing fatherhood in small, private rituals. Longer glance at school window displays, the new attention he paid to calendars and bedtime stories, the way his hands stopped fidgeting when he talked about next year. The trouble with happiness in this town is that it rarely gets a quiet hour to unpack its suitcase. Diane and Jack, reading currents the way sailors read seams on the water, called for a conversation no one enjoys having gone of those rooms where love is asked to tolerate fluorescent lighting and paper with signatures at the bottom. They didn't threaten, they did something gentler and harder. They asked for clarity that could survive daylight, and then they waited long enough for silence to do its cruel, necessary work. It was Claire who broke first, though breaking for her did not mean shattering. It meant choosing control over collapse and deciding, yet again, to define the narrative before it defined her. She arrived with a folder that had been handled with the caution people usually reserve for glass or bombs. Inside was paper that could be called many things depending on the month and the jurisdiction: preliminary, indicative, non-diagnostic. That did what paper does better than hope, it pointed. She explained without preamble that she had undergone an early non-invasive screening that captured cell-free fetal DNA fragments in her bloodstream and compared single nucleotide polymorphisms against reference profiles voluntarily supplied by Kyle and Nate. She did not pretend this was a verdict. She called it what the lab called it: an exclusionary analysis conducted at a gestational age when the fetal fraction is small and the confidence intervals are therefore not a place to build law or legacy. But even a thin signal can carry the loudest kind of meaning. The panel all but obliterated Kyle as a biological possibility, parity index trending toward zero across multiple loci where his alleles were absent, and the fetus associated haplotypes showed no compatible inheritance path through him. Nate, by contrast, was not excluded. At every probed locus the data sustained him as a potential progenitor, producing a non-exclusion profile that, while not proof, was the kind of preliminary geometry that tells you where the portrait is going once the lines darken. When she slid the pages across the table, Kyle went very still in the way people do right before something in them starts to make a sound they will remember for the rest of their lives. He did not argue with the science. He had, after all, been the one to insist on clean process and third-party chain of custody when they drew his sample, believing that certainty water direction it pointed was the only thing that could keep love from becoming a courtroom. Tears arrive the way weather does, from far away and all at once, and he let them fall because pretending you're not a person has never saved anyone in this family. Claire, whose genius for composure has been both alibi and weapon, lowered her eyes and let shame sit on her like a garment chosen for the wrong season. She said she had not wanted this, not the spectacle, not the arithmetic of alleles becoming the measure of a future, not the sentence she could see forming in Kyle's throat that began with when and ended with why. Jack kept his hands flat on the table, the way men who have steered through too many storms sometimes steady the furniture to keep from steadying themselves. Diane spoke softly but with surgical precision about next steps, about ethics and medicine, and the difference between being early and being right. No one shouted. Shouting is a luxury reserved for people whose names won't end up in minutes or press releases. The paradox clawing at the center of the room was simple and merciless. The fetus was young beyond reckoning, barely old enough for the test Claire had already done to have a respectable fetal fraction, and every ethical doctor in 100 miles would Advise against invasive sampling until risks to mother and child fell under thresholds a board could defend and a conscience could sleep near. That meant amniocentesis was weeks away, and chorionic villus sampling was a decision that carried its own daggered calculus. There are labs, of course, that will promise anything for a price and a waiver, but Jack did not build his life to trade it against the speed of a headline. And Victoria Becky's this story cannot be told without her shadow passing over it would not let medicine be bullied by impatience no matter how much the personal geometry made her want to tear pages out of calendars. So everyone in the room was left with the kind of truth most soap operas are allergic to, a waiting truth, a probability truth. A truth that asks adults to be adults even when the child in the story has not yet drawn breath. Nate was summoned and arrived wearing the only face a man in his position can wear if he intends to stand upright, open, stunned, accountable. He did not sputter or posture. He asked for the paperwork, read the statistical language without pretending that caution words meant comfort, and then asked Claire one question in a tone so careful it made the air feel taller. "Do you believe this is mine?" She nodded, and for a second the hush in the room acquired a different texture. The one that forms when a possibility accepts its own name. On what basis? A dozen voices in town would ask the moment the door closed. Could belief be asserted when proof must wait? The answer was unglamorous, and exactly right: biology and time. Claire had kept meticulous cycle logs and appointment notes. Not because she expected to weaponize them, but because people who live their lives by strategy keep receipts of their bodies the way they keep calendars of their meetings. The conception window her upcharted narrowed the field, and when overlaid with the dates and places that mapped her intimacy, Kyle's candidacy became not just genetically improbable but chronologically absurd. Holden polite and peripheral, his flirtations documented in public smiles more than private rooms fell away on the same axis. Nate, by contrast, dropped into the intersection of biology and circumstance with the sort of undeniability that makes denial look like a costume. From there the story did what it always does in Genoa City: it metastasized through context. The science was the center, but the center attracts everything that orbits power. Nate's professional ethics, once a line he defended against corporate temptation, and then, later, a wire he crossed during his tenure in Victoria's orbit, now became a lens held up against his face from every angle. He had loved Victoria. He still carried tenderness for the way she moves through a room with her guard drawn and her intelligence unsheathed in the possibility that he had fathered a child with the young woman Victoria had defended as daughter once upon a time was, even in a place this jaded, a powder mixture no one had seen before. It was not scandal for scandal's sake. It was the kind of knot that threads together boardroom governance, family loyalty, and the intimate arithmetic of who gets to call whom mine. Victoria, to her credit and her cost, did not break anything that could not be repaired. She acknowledged the preliminary science, named the waiting, and moved quickly to erect the only structures that keep storms from leveling people: boundaries. Claire would have medical privacy. Decisions about Jabot's succession would be quarantined from romantic contagion. Legal counsel would draw lines that would keep the innocent from being trampled by the merely loud. Jack, in his sphere, commissioned an HR protocol that read like a case study in how to protect a company from its self-recusal matrices, communications firewalls. A moratorium on any conversation where the word air could be heard near the word engagement. Diane did what Diane does when the house is on fire and there's still expensive art on the walls. She saved the pieces that would allow the family to recognize itself later. Advocating for compassion for Kyle that didn't condescend, for fairness toward Claire that didn't capitulate, for a version of the truth that grew up instead of lashing out. Meanwhile, the quieter mechanics of medicine moved toward the calendar like a patient tide. Claire Zob, who had the calm of people who spend their days translating fear into steps, explained fetal fraction curves and why some non-invasive paternity screens can produce reliable exclusions earlier than they can produce courtroom-grade confirmations. She described amnio not as a weapon but as a tool that, when used at the right time, yields answers that even the doubters find too heavy to kick. She cautioned against CVS given the specifics of Claire's case and the relative sliver of incremental time it would buy at real, if small, risk. She offered a date for a follow-up nip with expected fetal fraction above a threshold that makes statisticians smile, and she wrote it down not as an ultimatum but as a promise. In the interim, Claire did the bravest and most suspicious thing she could do at once. She kept going. She showed up to prenatal appointments with her notes in order and let the sonographer's wand turn anxiety into heartbeat. She texted Kyle, then stopped, then drafted messages to delete later because there is no etiquette for how to speak to a man you imagine would stand beside you at a bassinet when the math has written him out of the cradle. She called Nate, then didn't, then answered when he did with a small voice that surprised her, because strength, when applied all day to public optics, has to flow back into the body from somewhere. Nate, for his part, did not rehearse a hero. He asked about vitamins and nausea and whether she wanted him at the next appointment. He did not impose. He made a list of names of lawyers and doctors and therapists and then crossed almost all of them out because lists are what men make when they cannot fix the thing in front of them with their hands. Holden, poor Holden, a Rorschach blot for other people's suspicion, handled himself with the kind of grace that makes people decide they had always believed in him. He offered a public statement that said almost nothing and did it beautifully, in private. He offered Claire the only sentence she could accept from a man she did not love. Tell me how to be useful. On the Jabbet floor, work resumed and pretended not to be theater. But everyone knows that industry is how actors cope when the script takes a turn. Summer found Kyle on a bench outside a conference room and sat beside him without a speech, which is sometimes the only way to prevent a soul from cracking along the old lines. Jack knocked on his son's office door and then stood in the doorway for a moment longer than usual, as though remembering how much of fatherhood is simply making yourself visible when your child looks up, even if he does not. Diane brought tea and left it, because the women who are called calculating in this town are often the same women who remember to bring heat to cold rooms. When the second round of results arrived, they did what good science always does when invited to end a war early. They narrowed the battlefield until only the truth could stand in it. The fetal fraction had risen, the loci count expanded, the statistics moved from suggestive to robust. Again, Kyle was excluded with mathematical cruelty. Again, Nate was not excluded. This time with a paternity index that carried words like consistent with and highly supportive attached by sober technicians who are allergic to adjectives. It still wasn't an amnio. It still wouldn't hang a man in court or crown him in a nursery without the requisite signatures and the right week on a sonogram. But inside the human rooms where decisions are actually made, it was enough to pivot from anxiety to planning. Jack and Diane, in a conversation that contained both mercy and governance, told Kyle what he already knew and then did the thing parents try to do once in a while and usually fail at. They promised him that the love he had mobilized for a child would not go to waste, that fathering is a verb wider than blood, and that nothing about his readiness had been foolish. Having once more been asked by fate to fight a war onto France, protecting her own history while shepherding a piece of its future, called Nate into a room with no windows and told him that decency now required ruthlessness, no gloating, no positioning, no media, no leverage. If this child was his, he would prove it when medicine said the proof was safe to extract, and until then his job was to become the sort of man a child can meet without flinching. Nate said yes because saying anything else would have been the same as saying no. What Claire believed that Nate was the father never wavered, and belief of that kind, in that voice, has a way of shaping the air into something other people can breathe. She did not and will not be forgiven by everyone for the geography of her heart or the architecture of her ambition. Forgiveness is not a currency this community spends lightly, and the invoices they keep are long. But the story has, for the moment, acquired that strange, rare quality that makes Genoa City feel almost kind of pause. No coronations, no expulsions, no quick weddings to solve a PR problem, no midnight transfers of power disguised as HR memos. A pause in which a woman carries a life that will, regardless of surname, deserve a name said with tenderness. A pause in which a man who thought he would be a father learns how to dismantle his dream without breaking his gentleness. A pause in which another man measures his next steps not by how they will look in a mirror but by how they will look from 3 feet high. The amnio date sits on a calendar like a star you can navigate by. Between here and there is where the adults have to stay adult, and where the child's small enough to fit entirely inside a sentence, and yet large enough to reorder a city keeps time with a heartbeat no one can hear unless they are very close and very quiet.